Hello. I have to apologize in advance for the sound because I need my computer on for what I'm about to do. So before I get into this, I want to make a small segue and talk about words. Words are defined by the way that they're used, not by what they actually mean. Of course, that depends what you mean, but what words actually mean is determined by how they're used, not the other way around. The way that a word is used doesn't come from what it means. What it means comes from how it's used. That's an important distinction. And it's the same in mathematics. You know, the definitions in math, what they mean comes from how they're used, not the other way around. Again, this is important because it points out how words don't have an intrinsic definition. They don't represent the intrinsic properties of things. You know, a word like apple or a word like hammer don't represent anything intrinsically. They're just used to refer to certain things that we see, and that's it. And it's important because this is how we all learn about words. Nobody learns about words by reading the dictionary. We learn about words by hearing them as we're young, or by reading about them, by hearing how they're used. And by hearing how the word is used, we learn to understand what the word actually means, by first seeing other people use it. Right? So the usage of the word itself is what determines the meaning of the word. The point of that is sometimes words are used a certain way, but the way they're defined on paper doesn't actually coincide with the way that they're used. And the reason for that, at least for the word objective, is because the way the word objective is defined is that definition is erroneous. And it comes from the fact that people partition reality into objective and subjective things, into objects and subjects, which is a fallacy that has existed for hundreds of years and is only sort of drifting away now because people seem to understand that you can't partition reality into objective and subjective. And let me get into this. The other day, or like 4 days ago, I had a conversation, an argument, over YouTube with a guy who he has a longer username, but I'm gonna call him Big. And what he was basically talking about, this was on my Is There Objective Morality video. And he was criticizing me, and we had a huge exchange, like 70-something comments. Why I would do such a thing over YouTube, I don't know. I guess I enjoy argumentation, and I tried to get this guy to see my side, but you know, you can't get as much across through typing, so I'm gonna read this conversation out loud to you, and hopefully I'll be able to elucidate the issue at hand and explain a bit about why the definitions of these words are erroneous. They're erroneous because they get people into certain traps, into logical fallacies and logical contradictions without realizing it. Anyway, so we're gonna begin. So in my objective morality video, I emphasized consensus, and I emphasized how yes, there is objective morality through consensus. This guy was saying, Big said, you don't understand what objective means at all. Your self-made definition of the word is arbitrary and meaningless. Well, as I just pointed out, all definitions are arbitrary because they're all defined by how they're used. All definitions are arbitrary in mathematics as well. That's just how it is. If you can't deal with the fact that all definitions are arbitrary, then you need to reevaluate yourself. So I said, all definitions are arbitrary, my friend. And Big responded with, no. If I said that an apple is a hammer, I would obviously be wrong because an apple does not function in the same way a hammer does. Okay, that's not what arbitrary means. Arbitrary, the words apple and hammer are arbitrarily defined. Apple can mean anything. It refers to a type of fruit only because that is how it's used. Because when you're young, you read a book or you saw a cartoon or something where you're learning the English language, where some funny cartoon character points to an apple, to a round red fruit, and says, "This is an apple." That's the only reason we call it an apple. Apple can mean anything. Okay? The way I'm using the word objective is how it is used in conversation. The definition I come up with is there to accommodate the usage of the word. That's the definition I came up with in the video, where objective meant heavy emphasis on consensus, because you do need consensus for there to be an objective fact. So Big says, something is objective when its existence is independent from consciousness. That is what the word means. Yes, and that is the definition you're going with, first of all. That's not the definition you get everywhere. That's not, I mean, that's kind of the definition that you get in a dictionary, but in a dictionary you might hear something like, oh, well, it's the properties of the object, not of the conscious subject, which doesn't imply independence, but if you're going with independent of consciousness, this definition is erroneous. You cannot have something that is independent of consciousness. At least what you're referring to is independent of consciousness. The way you're referring to it, you can't do that. So I say, and that definition is obviously circular, since nothing can be perceived outside of consciousness, hence why it is better to think of things in terms of how they are understood rather than how they are. So Big says it's not circular. Just because something can be perceived outside of consciousness does not mean the thing you are perceiving is not objective. So right there he says, you know, something can be perceived outside of consciousness does not mean the thing you are perceiving is not objective. So objective doesn't refer to things being perceived by consciousness. Again, if it doesn't refer to things being perceived by a conscious entity, then it is Plato's form. It is the ontological truth of the universe. This is what I say in my next comment. I say, well, Big, something outside of consciousness can't even be discussed. It's the same as Plato's forms, or the 100% accurate ontological truth of reality. You know, things in this category are held to an impossible standard and therefore shouldn't even be talked about. The word objective, however, is used all the time, and not in reference to things that exist outside of consciousness. Ergo, it shouldn't be used to refer to things outside of consciousness, outside of human perception. Big says, everything we see around us exists outside of consciousness. If you removed all consciousness from existence right now, everything around you would still remain. Okay, but see, that's not a judgment you're making outside of consciousness. That's your judgment, and you're conscious, therefore Big. It can't be that fact that everything around us continues to exist even if we vanish. That is not a fact. That fact that is independent of consciousness, given that you are a conscious entity making that statement. Everything would remain because of what we understand about the laws of physics. Physics predicts what will happen to the matter on Earth even if all humans suddenly vanish. But this physics is still man-made, so at best it is a good guess as to what will happen and not a statement about something outside of consciousness. You cannot make statements outside of consciousness, people. You are a conscious being. You cannot say something that isn't independent of you as a person, your understanding of reality. So Big says, no, physics aren't man-made. Gravity exists regardless of whether or not anyone is there to witness it. Oh my god. So this is where I start to get a little upset, because I know physics. See, I have a shirt that has physics on it. I know physics. And physics are man-made. Gravity exists whether or not anyone is there to witness it. Okay. If no one was there to witness it, we wouldn't be able to say that it exists. That's the whole point, right? And furthermore, we don't even understand how gravity actually works, not in its entirety. All right? So what you think you know about physics is man-made, or perceived through a man-made lens. Measurements of gravity are made with human eyes and human instruments, so in the end, there is nothing outside of consciousness. This entire thing, I was basically commenting on what he was actually saying, because the point is, what he was talking about was in direct contradiction to the fact that he was talking about it. That's the whole issue here. Because he's talking about things that can't be perceived by consciousness whilst he's a conscious entity typing on a keyboard talking about them. That's the big issue. You're just saying your whole issue in this conversation, Big, was the fact that what you are talking about and what you're saying, what you're talking about and the fact that you're talking about it are in contradiction with each other. You say these are things we can't talk about, but you're talking about them. Big. So what you know about physics is man-made, or perceived through man-made. Yeah, so that's what I said. And then he says, well, we use man-made constructs such as science and mathematics to understand the objective world around us. Are you implying that gravity doesn't exist and only exists within our minds? Again, you're using objective to refer to things outside of human perception. If you're going to do that, then you can't use objective in conversation ever, because it's outside of human perception. Right? Like, the only statement that you can make about things outside of human perception is that they're outside of human perception and can't be talked about. That's the only statement you can make about them. Or similar statements like that one. You can't actually discuss things outside of human perception. That's the point. They are outside of human perception, independent. That is the erroneous definition of objective, because you don't talk about these things. The objective world, outside of human perception, I say, cannot be discussed. What you think you know about gravity is a man-made construct or a man-made attempt at understanding the so-called objective world. But in this definition, objective is silly, since it has nothing to do with how the word is actually used in conversation. Yeah, which is exactly what I just said. So Big says, I don't know what your strict definition of objective is, but I'm pretty sure I've never used it that way in conversation. Yeah, because Big, because you can't use it in that way in conversation. Because the way you've used it is in contradiction with the way you just used it in the previous comment, where you said that the objective world is independent of consciousness. If you're using it in conversation, then it's not independent of consciousness. In conversation, objective is simply used to refer to something that is true universally. Or true for all people, rather than subjective, where it's true for that individual alone. Words should be defined based on how they're used, and the usage of the word objective is simply in reference of greater, more accurate truths that have the consensus of the scientific community. Hence why I fixate on that in my video. In my video, I talked about how objective truth is predicated on consensus by the scientific community. That's the way it works. That's what objective reality is. And I use that as evidence to explain what objective morality is, but that's further down the line. So Big says, well, then I agree completely. Oh, great. So here at this point I finally got him to agree. While I was actually typing this, I wasn't looking at his previous comments, so I didn't notice the fact that he misused objective twice. He used it once to refer to things that were dependent on consciousness, and then he used it again in reference to things that are independent of consciousness. So he says, then I agree completely. Something objective is something that is true. Something that is subjective is an opinion. Whew. I have a problem with that, right? Opinions can be true. Right? You don't want to partition reality. You don't want to partition statements into truths and opinions. You don't want to do that. Everything is an opinion. Okay, not everything is a truth, but everything is an opinion. That makes a whole lot more sense, thinking about it that way, because you can't accurately distinguish between opinions and truths, right? The truth about physics, or science, or the Big Bang Theory or anything, is just an opinion by literature and scientists. That's all it is. It's still an opinion. It's an opinion with an overwhelming consensus to it, but it's still an opinion. Right? So you can't distinguish between opinions and truths, and you shouldn't try to, because you get into a whole... you get into a very hairy area. Where do you draw that line? Right? When does an opinion become a true opinion? And you run into all sorts of weird fallacies and contradictions, as we will see later on from Big. So I'd say, well, I agree with this, even though I shouldn't have agreed with this. But I was sort of trying to get him to see my side. I'm like, yes, but it's important to understand that what one believes to be true is still seen through a human lens, and a rather inaccurate one at that. Most of the theories physics deals with are in very simplified cases, like spherical symmetry and vacuum conditions. I was trying to sound smart to get him to see, okay, that guy knows about physics. I probably shouldn't debate him on this. It didn't work. I was trying to appeal to authority. Forgive me for that. Anyway, so Big says, but we can still make claims about what we see around us with reasonable certainty. I'm typing on a keyboard right now. I can say that with as much certainty as possible. Yes, you can say that with as much certainty as possible, but that is not objective certainty by how you used objective in the line before, right? Because in the line before, where is it? You said, what did you say? You say the objective world is not dependent on man-made constructs. So not dependent on physics or science or math. The objective world is the objective world. Okay? Sure. But then your keyboard, you typing on a keyboard is not an objective fact by that notion, because you typing on your keyboard is not something that's in the objective world. It's something that's heavily dependent on your perception and your eyesight and your senses, which are all human perception. So it's as much certainty as possible, but it is not objective certainty by the definition of objective you used a few lines earlier. So I agree with this. So in this thing I say I agree. Reasonable certainty is sufficient. I mean, if you think me emphasizing consensus was a mistake, then that's the question. But if you don't believe me that it's necessary, I challenge you to find me an objective fact that isn't associated with an overwhelming consensus of the populace. Right? Seriously, try to find me an objective fact where there's no consensus. It doesn't, where there's no consensus of the scientific community, at least. Try to find me an objective fact without the consensus of the scientific community. You can't have it. Ergo, it appears to seem like the consensus of the scientific community is a requirement for there to be an objective fact. So Biggs says, the Earth orbiting the Sun was at one time certainly not a consensus. A belief in it was an imprisonable offense. Okay, see, here's the problem with that, right? You can't think of a fact today that doesn't have the consensus of the scientific community. So what you're forced to do, in order to counter my point, is to look back through history when what we know to be true today wasn't known to be true back then. But that doesn't work, because if you were alive back then, you wouldn't believe that. Alright? Look for a fact today that doesn't have the consensus of the scientific community. It can't be done. Right? Which is proof that consensus of the scientific community is a requirement for something to be objective. The consensus on hard facts changes in light of new evidence, but it does so only because there is an implicit consensus about how the scientific method works, and that new evidence necessarily forces one to redefine a model. No matter what people disagree on, there is always something they will agree on. So in this statement, I was basically trying to tell him that even though people might not have conceded on what the objective truth was, they still did agree on what the scientific method was. In other words, there is always some consensus when you're talking to a person, which is another issue, right? Just by communicating with you guys in English, there is consensus, implicit consensus on what English words mean between us. In other words, consensus is again present. Okay? If we're using logic or math, there is consensus on axioms of logic and axioms of math and definitions of math. So he says, okay, but Biggs says, but that doesn't change the fact that consensus has been wrong in the past. I also don't know why you put so much stake in consensus, as though it's some kind of litmus truth test. Okay, it being wrong in the past means nothing. Things we know are always end up being wrong. That's the way it is. That's the way the scientific method is. You can't talk about things that are always right. Right? Because you don't know if anything that human beings know will always be right. Okay, we believe in the scientific method today. Maybe we'll find out in 1,000 years' time that the scientific method is completely wrong. Maybe we'll completely redefine logic as well. Who knows? Right? Maybe it's possible. Right? So you can't put stake into something that is always true, because nothing is always true. Nothing that exists, that is knowable, that is known, is always true. So consensus is the only thing you're dealing with, right? So I'm saying it's been wrong in the past, and it can be wrong in the future, and probably wrong now, but it's the only standard we have. The only standard for truth that exists is the scientific standard, which is a standard that strives to achieve full consensus among scientists. I'm putting stake into it because it's the truth. Again, it's the only workable truth. So Biggs says, I have no problem with scientific consensus between scientists that know what they're talking about, but you seem to be implying more than that, that if humanity had reached a consensus on something, that it somehow makes it more valid. That's not what I said in the video. I said that we should pay attention to the consensus among scientists and people who don't have personality disorders. That's what I said in the video. Okay? Now, I remember this now, but in the comment I didn't actually. So what I said, well, I don't recall if I specified in this video, but scientific consensus has a lot more weight to it than general consensus. Or at least general consensus without scientific consensus is usually an indication of something being off. I'm saying that consensus of scientifically literate people that know what they're talking about is essentially what is true at any point in time. So Biggs says, Well, I agree that scientific consensus obviously has more weight to it than unformed consensus. But why are you applying scientific consensus to a philosophical topic like morality? Because I'm trying to establish a moral truth. That's what it means. I'm saying that moral truths are truths that have the consensus of scientific communities and people who don't have personality disorders. Okay? And that's the gist of it. But in my comment, so my response is this. I say there's a bunch of reasons, and it could be a much longer discussion. The basic idea is that you can change people's minds on what is true and what is not, but I strongly doubt that you can change people's minds on what is right and what is wrong. For instance, you cannot convince a psychopath to be a normal person. The reason I emphasize consensus is because when it comes to morality, we do not want, nor can we ever truly get, the consensus of psychopaths and people with personality disorders, which is what I said in my video. To establish a moral truth, we need the consensus of people who are not psychopaths, who do not have personality disorders, because we can never get their consensus. Even if they say that they're agreeing with us, they are lying, because they're psychopaths. So then Big says, she starts talking about math. Okay, great, I know math. This has more to do with determinism than anything else. I think it has to do with objectivity and subjectivity as well. The reason you can change someone's mind on something like 2 + 2 = 5 is because you can give objective evidence that why 2 + 2 = 4 is the correct answer. The same can't really be said for more personal issues. You can't give someone an objective reason why they should behave a certain way, because it has to do with personal preference, which is by definition subjective. Oh my god. 2 + 2 = 5 and 2 + 2 = 4 are also personal preferences that just have unanimous consensus in the mathematical community and the global community. 2 + 2 can equal 5, right? You can just switch 4 and 5 in, take the natural numbers and then switch 4 and 5 so that the numbers go 1, 2, 3, 5, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, etc. Okay? Just switch those two numbers and then everything still works exactly the same. The symbols mean the other thing. Okay? And then 2 + 2 would equal 5 and 2 + 2 would not equal 4, right? So then 5 comes after 3 before 4, 4 comes after 5 before 6, and that's exactly the same. Just 5 now means 4, 4 now means 5. It's exactly the same. What the symbol actually means is predicated on unanimous consensus. Okay? By our definition, by our consensus as human beings that know these Arabic numbers system and use them, the number that comes after 3 is 4. And the number that comes after 4 is 5, and before 6. But that doesn't have to be the case. We could switch those around. Also, all of this is predicated on the definition of the plus operator, which also is predicated on unanimous consensus, and the definition of the equals sign, which also predicated on unanimous consensus. Okay, so I said depends what you mean by objective again, because at this point I sort of forgot what he meant by objective before. There may be one single answer to the question, what is good for everyone? That most people just don't know and need to be told. Right. And Big's response, well, I meant objective in the same way that you meant it. I can assure you, Big, that you did not mean it in the same way that I meant it. If you meant it in the same way that I meant it, we would not have disagreed to begin with. I meant objective in the same way that you meant it, as something that is true. But there's no objective reason why we should want what is good for everyone. The fact that you want what is good for everyone is your subjective preference. Again, you're trying to distinguish between opinions and truths, which you can't do. Okay, because it's not an easily well-defined thing that you can do. You can't easily distinguish between opinions and truths. What makes wanting what is good for everyone a subjective truth? Everyone wants what is good for themselves, and what is good for everyone is just an amalgam of what everybody wants. It's no more subjective than sexual reproduction being something people want to do to propagate their own gene being subjective. That's not subjective, right? That's an objective fact. Right? Preferences are objects. They exist within our mind as thoughts, as neurons, as something, as information. Information is not something that doesn't exist. Information is just a trick, but it does have a physical representation within reality. So my response I don't think we're using objective the same way again, right? Because we're not. When I talk about morality, my desire is to get people to agree with me, just as my desire to get people to agree with me on what is true holds when discussing whether something is true or not. I can use objective for both, again, because I'm using objective to refer to simply what I think is true. That's all I'm using it for. Objective is what I think is true. Essentially, that's like a rough definition. It is not something that is independent of my consciousness. I would never think that, because that's ludicrous. So Big says, so you don't think that it is objective, meaning that it's something we should do based on truth. Again, that we should find what is good for everyone. It is your preference to find what is good for everyone. Okay, you're using truth wrong now, Big. You are talking about truth, descriptive truth, but there are moral truths, right? There are normative truths, or at least there can be. We can, like, truth can refer to moral truths as well. For instance, it is a moral truth that I should do what is in my best interest. I can say that that's a moral truth. You might not agree with me, but that's why there's no consensus, and that's why it's not objective, you see? So my response is, well, there are truths about reality, and then there are moral truths. Objective morality operates in the realm of moral truths. So I'm explaining to him now that the way he's using truth isn't actually accurate. He's only referring to truths about reality, not truths about morality. So Big says, by truths about reality, I assume you mean things like the sky is blue, grass is green, etc. Just as basic examples, obviously these things are self-evidently true. How do you go about demonstrating objective morality, moral truth? Again, you are misusing the word truth. Okay? Just by saying that, Big, you are misusing the word truth. You saw my definition of truth, and then you threw it out the window, completely ignored it. Okay? Because I said there's truths about reality, and then there's truths about morality. They're a separate category. Try to just accept that. Okay? So Big says, what I say, in the exact same way. Killing someone, not for the greater good, is bad just as self-evident. The only people who wouldn't agree, are psychopaths. Analogously, people who wouldn't agree that the sky is blue are colorblind. Psychopaths are morality blind. It's the same principle, right? You know, someone who looks at the sky and says, well, the sky's not blue, when everybody agrees that it is a crazy person. And someone who enjoys killing, not for the greater good, is also a crazy person. So Big says, well, let me phrase it another way. If you had to convince me not to kill, how would you go about it? Oh God, Big, if you are someone who kills people, then I don't even know why I'm bothering with you. I don't even care about your consensus if you're someone who likes killing people. It depends on the situation, Big. If you're a psychopath, you know, I can't convince you. It's in your genes. If it's in your genes, but if it's not in your gene, but it's a crime of passion, then the best I could do is convince you that it isn't in your self-interest, and you would later regret it. If you're a murderer, that is. Then Big's like, well, why should I act in my own self-interest? Is there an objective reason to do so? Yes, there is, Big. You will act in your own self-interest. You are always acting in your own self-interest. That is what your brain is programmed to do. Stop saying about whether you should or shouldn't. You do or you don't. So Big says, you are acting... what I say, you are acting in your own self-interest, or trying to at least, no matter what. Your brain is programmed to believe in certain shoulds and should-nots. Then Big says, what if it was in someone's best interest to kill, steal, etc.? Like I said, if they think killing is okay and it's not for the greater good, then they're a psychopath, like a crazy person. Then I shouldn't agree with them, or I shouldn't pay attention to them, just like I shouldn't give a shit if someone who's looking at the sky is saying the sky is orange when it's not sunset. What if it was in someone's best interest? Okay, so what I say, well, I can only argue out of what I believe their self-interest to be. Objective and subjective does not partition reality into two non-intersecting sets. The two sets have to be identical by the classic definition, because all subjects are objects and all objects can only be perceived by subjects. We're going back to the definition of objective, because this is really the debate here. I think you're using so Big says, I think you're using a different term for objective again because you've lost me. No, Big, I am using the term that we've been using the whole time. I'm trying to show you how your term for objective doesn't make any goddamn sense. And the fact that you're using it and then literally contradicting yourself and when you're talking about objective facts that aren't perceived by consciousnesses. So what I say, he says that I lost him. So this is what I say. I say basically when people talk about reality, they think that they are talking about objects. When they're talking about morality, they think that they're talking about subjects. The point here is that both subjects and object, the point here is that both are subjects and objects, and there is no fine partition that divides us between the two. Rather, reality isn't subjects, but all subjects are objects and all objects can only be perceived by subjects, my preceding line. So Big says, the way I see it is this: if someone can't give an objective justification as to why an act is good or bad, then morality doesn't exist. Even if you were to say you should act in your own self-interest, this is just an appeal to preference and not one to an objective standard. Jesus Christ. So here's the problem with these definitions of objective, is that you get into crazy land when you start saying shit like morality doesn't exist. Morality doesn't exist, folks. It exists as a thought in your mind. It exists. Okay, it exists as an object. It really, truly does exist. It exists as a word, for God's sake. That is still existence. What does the word existence really mean? You mean does it have to exist as like a piece of matter to exist? Because wait, he does eventually say that it has to exist as a piece of matter to exist, which is crazy, as I'll explain in a second. So this is what I say. I say, doesn't exist. Why are you replying to my messages or interested in these topics? Because your brain is driving you to do so. Your brain is an object in reality. Your brain's belief that you should act in your own self-interest is an object in reality. Therefore, morality is an object in reality. If it didn't exist, it couldn't be talked about. Strict definition of existence. So then he says, if Mickey Mouse didn't exist, then he couldn't be talked about. Oh my God. That's not what existence means, Big. Mickey Mouse doesn't exist as an object, but he exists as a thought. He exists as a cartoon. And in fact, there are costumes of him. He does exist in certain mediums and certain avenues. He doesn't exist as a real... Mickey Mouse is a weird example, because you can't, like... He doesn't exist as a real individual, maybe, because there's no unanimous agreement that he does. Everyone acknowledges that he's a cartoon. If everyone saw Mickey Mouse walking down the street, and he was like a cartoon... I don't even know how it would work, but if everyone saw him, then it'd be like, oh, that's Mickey Mouse, and then there'd be unanimous agreement that Mickey Mouse is a real person. So what I say to him is, if you talk about it, it exists as neurons in your mind. You cannot make the claim that these things don't exist. Everything exists as a thought, rather. Existing in the mind is still existing. Yes, existing in the mind is still existing. So then Big says this. And this is where we get to the problem with these definitions of objective and subjective. This is what Big says. This goes back to my definitions of objective and subjective. Objective, something that's existence is independent from consciousness. Subjective, something that's existence is dependent on consciousness. If the only place it exists is in my mind, then it's subjective. Morality can only exist in my mind, therefore morality is subjective. That's my view anyway. As I pointed out, nothing is independent of consciousness. Nothing at all. You cannot say something that is existence is independent of consciousness. But you know what? I'm going to roll with this. I'm going to say, okay, if the only place it exists is in your mind, then it's subjective. Okay, fine. But then by that logic, numbers are subjective. Right? You don't see numbers in reality. You don't see numbers walking around. There's no number safari anywhere. Is there like a number safari in Africa somewhere? No. Numbers only exist in your mind. And in everybody's mind. The difference between numbers and things like Mickey Mouse or Santa Claus or whatever is that numbers exist in everybody's mind because everybody has a genetic predisposition to perceiving the world through numbers. Okay? But if you want to go with this, if you want to go with the idea that numbers are only things that exist in the mind, then all of mathematics, all of logic, all of philosophy are only things that exist in the mind, including this conversation. Words are only things that exist in the mind. But that's really bad, because then that means that all scientific measurements, which are done using numbers, exist in the mind. It also means things like color exist in the mind, right? And things like sound, and things like touch. These are things that exist because of in our brains, in our minds. They don't actually represent real things, right? You can't point to me to a somewhere in the world and say that there is pain. That doesn't exist in the mind. Okay? And color is just how we perceive light. It's not the way light actually is. The way light actually is it has a wavelength and it just travels through space. So, by this definition, big, everything exists in the mind. Everything does. Everything we know about, at least. Like you've already lost big just by saying this, because numbers are for sure things that only exist in the mind. They do. Point me to a number in real life somewhere. A number that isn't existing in the mind, that exists in the world. So then I say to him, let me make this absolutely clear to you. Nothing exists independent of consciousness. Everything you believe exists depends on consciousness. So Biggs responds, and you know this how? If all consciousness was removed from existence instantly, everything around us would still exist. The trees, the sky, literally everything except concepts that are dependent on consciousness, such as numbers, such as thoughts, emotions, morality, etc., would exist. The universe is not dependent on consciousness. That's an incredibly arrogant statement. That seems to imply the universe was tailor-made for us, and I highly doubt that is the case. That does not suggest at all that the universe was tailor-made for us. It says nothing of the sort. It says that what we know about the universe is tailor-made for us, because that's how it is. But again, you're saying that things would continue to exist even if we weren't around. The trees, the sky. You know this, and you know that how? How do you know that that's true, independent of your consciousness? You only know that because you have physics that you know that is dependent on your consciousness. Big? So then I say, what are trees, sky, everything around us? How do we know that these things exist? If we see them with our eyes, then they are dependent on consciousness. I think it's more arrogant to say that what you're saying, because partitioning reality into two leaves consciousnesses all high and mighty in a separate category, which is really the problem I have with these definitions. You know, saying that, you know, there's subjective facts and then there's subjective facts suggests that consciousness is something special. Consciousness is something really special, that it totally redefines the way you can look at reality. Okay, that consciousnesses have this amazing ability to totally redefine what reality actually is by looking at it. That and only non-conscious entities are the way things truly are. It's really weird. You get into very logicalist territories by adopting these definitions. And it also falls in line with the whole determinism free will thing. And of course there is no free will, which is again an example of how you can't partition reality into objective and subjective, into consciousnesses and non-consciousnesses. So Biggs' response, no. We know they exist because we have consciousnesses to perceive them. They don't exist because of consciousness. I never said that they exist because of consciousness. I'm saying that the definition of existence itself is something that is dependent on consciousness. Anyway, things don't magically pop into existence just because there's something conscious to perceive it. Going by your logic, I suppose the Big Bang and Ice Age never happened because consciousness wasn't around to perceive it at the time. No, Big, that is not by my logic. I never said that. This is a semantics argument, Big, not a scientific argument. And then he says, how does my view leave consciousness all high and mighty? I'd say the exact opposite. You're implying that things only exist because of consciousness. You seem to be saying reality is dependent on consciousness. Your view makes consciousness high and mighty, not mine. Reality is dependent on consciousness, Big. Okay? The view that it is high and mighty comes from the fact that you are partitioning reality into two. If you do this, then it leaves consciousness in a separate category to think itself as a special little niche of its own that you can't get to by just being an object, by being a consciousnessless object. So, I'm trying to backtrack here a bit, but what I say here isn't actually correct, at least the first part of it. So what I say is, I'm not saying reality is dependent on consciousness. I'm not distinguishing between reality and consciousness at all. To me, reality and consciousness are basically the same thing. You implicitly divide the universe in two every time you speak. And I quote him and I say, No, we know they exist. No, we know they exist because we have consciousness to perceive them. And my response to that is, but you're contradicting yourself just as you say this, Big. If you need consciousness in order to perceive reality, then reality cannot be independent of consciousness. So stop suggesting that it is. Nobody is saying things pop into existence because consciousness is there. What I'm saying is the very definition of existence itself is contingent upon the presence of consciousness. There cannot be any kind of existence without consciousness. That doesn't mean there is non-existence. It means that there is an undefined existence. Okay, existence, the word existence, isn't defined until there is a consciousness present. So he quotes me on the very last thing I said there, that nobody is saying things pop into existence, yada yada yada. So he said, so I'll ask again, did the Big Bang and Ice Age really happen? After all, no consciousness existed at the time to perceive them, so how could they have done according to your logic? I'm not saying you have to be there. Oh my god. So the problem here is the fact that he can't actually come up with an example of an objective fact that no consciousness knows about. The reason we know about the Big Bang and Ice Ages is because of historical evidence. And the Big Bang Theory and Ice Ages are events that we've surmised have happened based on the evidence we've collected today. They are not things that are independent of consciousness. They are very much dependent on our own consciousness, Big. You are continuously, constantly making the mistake of ignoring what you're saying and what you're talking about. So not what you're saying, what you're talking. You are consistently making the mistake of contradicting, of what you're talking about contradicting with the thing that you're actually saying. I'm sure if I explained that well. God, I'm getting confused. Anyway, let's press on to get through this maelstrom. So, what we think that the Big Bang and Ice Ages occurred. What we understand and know about these events is dependent on us. So Big says, what we know about these events is completely irrelevant as to whether or not they actually happened. Events happen regardless of whether we know of them or not, so I don't see why you think they are dependent on consciousness. Jesus Christ, Big. How do you know that they happened? How do you know that they happened? Because you read about them in a book? What do you mean they actually happened? How do you define something happening? So Big says, I'm not sure how to answer that. A moment in time is something happening, so things are always happening. For example, the other day my pen rolled off the table and fell onto the floor without me or anyone else being present when it took place. Does that mean that my pen didn't roll off the table because there was no one around to perceive it? That's obviously ridiculous. Okay, so then we go down to the definition of events taking place, events happening. So here's the way I define it. There's two ways you know an event took place. You perceive it through raw sensory data, sight, sound, smell, etc. You experience the world around you and your brain records this data as memory. So that would be if you were there when the Big Bang and Ice Ages took place, you experienced them physically. Number two, you can perceive them through abstract data recognition, i.e. when something is communicated to you through language, i.e. your friend tells you he was at the bar yesterday and you choose to believe him. Or you can read about an event in a book, or you can perceive it by seeing the event's effects and coming up with a theory or a model to explain why it happened, which is what the Big Bang Theory is. Your memory of your pen being on your desk, your memory was your pen being on your desk, but this contradicts the sensory data where your pen was on the ground. Hence your brain tries to come up with an explanation for what might have happened by using what it knows about pens, physics, etc. Both kinds of events, whether perceived directly or indirectly through language and theorizing, require subjects to be perceived. You are seeking to distinguish between events you learn through language and theory, and events you learn directly through sight, sound, etc. But the word objective is not used to distinguish between events in this manner. It is used to establish correctness, accuracy, which isn't dependent on how the event is perceived. Again, Big, we seem to agree on first principles here, but we're disagreeing on the conclusion. The only way that that's happening is either we have different definitions, which we don't, because we seem to be trying to agree on definitions, or you aren't paying attention to what you're actually saying, Big. You are saying one thing, and then the thing you're talking about is contradicting what you're saying. I agree that that's how we can know events took place, but you seem to be arguing that events take place are dependent on consciousness, but I don't see how that is the case. Jesus Christ, Big, I just fucking told you how it's dependent on consciousness. I just said you need to be there to see it or perceive it through language. How does that not go through in your mind? How does that not make sense to you that that means it's dependent on consciousness? How do you still think that it's independent of consciousness after knowing how we learn about these events? So this is what I say. Knowing about events is what makes them dependent on consciousness. You seem to think the Big Bang took place, but you only know this because you read it in a book, or heard about it somewhere, or learned it through some mechanism, especially since what we know about the Big Bang is predicated on what we know about its remnants today, cosmic microwave background. I'm not saying consciousness needed to be at the Big Bang to check if the Big Bang took place. I'm saying that a consciousness needed to be somewhere or somewhen in order to know whether a Big Bang took place. There is only what we know, there is no what actually happened. There is only what we know, there is no what actually happened, in quotes. So Big's response: of course consciousness is needed to know if something took place. Something that isn't conscious can't know anything. I don't understand what you mean by there is no what actually happened. If there is no what actually happened, then what we know is something that we're just completely making up. It's not based on something that actually happened. Yes! Yes, Big. Everything is something that we are completely making up. It's true. It's true. It's frightening, but it is true. Everything you know about the world is something that scientists have made up. But it's the only truth. It's just, that is scary, but that's the only truth metric that exists. So just roll with it. So my response: if consciousness is needed to know if events take place, then there are no events that are independent of consciousness. Again, listen to your word use. What does being independent of consciousness even mean at that point? In any case, the word objective is used to establish correctness or accuracy, and not whether an event took place in the presence of consciousness or not. That is the fundamental crux of this. Objective, the word objective, has nothing to do with dependence or independence on consciousness. I make that absolutely clear. The word objective cannot possibly mean independent of consciousness, because what it means is it's independent of certain kind of biases. That's what the word objective means. Right? A scientific perspective is objective because it is independent of certain cultural and emotional biases. Okay? A religious perspective is not objective because it is dependent on certain cultural biases. Objective means independent of certain human biases, but it does not mean independent of all human biases, because you can't be independent of all human biases. It is impossible to be independent of all human biases, Big. It doesn't work. The scientific method is still a bias. It is a scientific bias, but that is the only truth bias that exists, right? So the word objective is simply cutting off certain biases and leaving the others. Leaving the scientific ones, leaving the logic ones. That is what the word objective actually means in its use. Big says, consciousness is needed to know if events take place, but events take place regardless of whether or not we know about them. So events are not dependent on consciousness. Our knowing of events is dependent on consciousness, but the events themselves aren't. Okay. If you don't know that events take place, you can't say that they take place, Big. If you don't know about them, you cannot say that they take place. You pay attention to what you're saying. You said right here, we need to know if events take... Consciousness is needed to know if events take place. But they take place regardless of whether or not we know. No! No! You can't say that! You just admitted. You just admitted. The very first 4 words you admitted that consciousness is needed. Okay? And right after that you say, but we know that they take place or not. Or you rather, Big, seem to know that events take place whether or not consciousness knows about them. Even though, in the first 5 words of your sentence, you said that consciousness is needed to know. And then you say consciousness isn't needed to know. What gives you this omniscient view that you know that events take place without consciousness, but you still seem to think that consciousness is needed to know if they take place or not? It's, pay attention to what you're saying, Big. The second part of the sentence is contradicting the first. Your performative norm is contradicting the thing that you're saying. What you're saying is in direct conflict with the thing that you're talking about. By the thing that you said, you cannot talk about the thing that you're talking about. My issue here is that Big seems to understand very well what he's talking about. He does. He seems to know what he's talking about. But he doesn't know what he's saying. That's the issue. You need to know both what you're saying and what you're talking about. So I say, Big, that right there is your mistake. Events that take place without us knowing about them are not events that can ever be discussed. Again, there is only what we know, there is no what actually happens. You cannot discuss events that actually happen without us knowing about them. It's impossible. In other words, knowledge determines truth. Knowledge determines truth. Truth that is independent of knowledge is not truth at all. Truth that is independent of knowledge is a Plato's form. It is an ontological, universal truth that cannot be discussed. It is outside of human perception, and therefore it is not epistemologically conceivable. It is not within our... It is not fathomable. A truth that is not known or knowable, a truth that is not knowable might as well be ignored, but a truth that isn't known cannot be called a truth. You can't call it a truth. It is literally pointless, totally pointless to discuss it whatsoever. Okay? You are in undefined territory if you are discussing a truth that isn't known. Anyway, Big's response. Well, of course events that take place without us knowing them can't be discussed. We don't know about them. Does that mean these events didn't happen? Or events don't even exist until they're discussed? Going by this logic, the Big Bang didn't actually happen until we discovered it happened. Oh my god. Big. Like, am I crazy here? Big. Look at what you just said. Look at what you just said. This is what he just said. This is what he just said. He said, well, of course, events that take place without us knowing about them can't be discussed. We don't know about them. Does that mean these events didn't happen, or events don't happen until they're discussed? No, Big. You just said they can't be discussed. Why are you continuing to try and discuss them? Again, what you're talking about and what you're saying are in conflict with each other. Well, of course, these events take place without us knowing about them. Well, of course, events that take place without us knowing about them can't be discussed. Does that mean these events didn't happen? No, Big, it doesn't mean that. They can't be discussed. Well, of course they can't be discussed, but does that mean they didn't happen? No, Big, they can't be discussed. But does that mean they didn't happen? No, it doesn't mean they didn't happen. It doesn't mean they did happen. It means they can't be discussed, Big. It means they're in a limbo state of logic. They can't be discussed. But does that mean they can't be discussed? No, Big! Holy shit, it's like we're going in circles, okay? The thing you just said is that they can't be discussed, and then in the very next sentence you are discussing them by asking me the question whether or not they didn't happen or whether or not they don't happen until we know about them, okay? By admitting that they can't be discussed, you literally can't construct sentences about them, Big. Do you understand that? You can't say things about them if they can't be discussed. You can't talk about them. You can't consider them at all. So stop trying to. It's like you're trying to talk about events that we can't know about. You can't do that. That's what I'm saying. By your own admission, you can't do that. So I explained to him, I try to get this across because he's going over binary logic here. Logic of events taking place isn't binary. Okay? It's not true or false whether an event happened or did not. An event that we know happened, true, for instance. An event that did not happen, if it happening contradicts something that we know, false. And then there's events we don't know about. Now, events we don't know about can't be said to have happened or not happened. They are in a weird limbo state. They are undefined. Talking about them is dividing by zero, undefined. Okay, so when you're talking about events we don't know about, you are in undefined territory. You cannot talk about, which is why you cannot talk about these events. You are dividing by zero. Just like you can't divide by zero in math, you can't talk about events people don't know about. Just basic logic, right? Basic semantics. And here's a good example. For example, there could be stars beyond the observable universe, which is 43 billion light years in radius. But these stars cannot be said to exist or not exist. Nothing concrete can be said about them since there is no solid evidence pointing us in any direction. I mean, okay, there is some evidence pointing us to the suggestion that there might be stars, because there's no reason to think that the universe just ends where the light ray ends. So they probably do exist. But right now, you can't say that they do exist, you can't say that they don't exist. You can't say anything. You can say that they might exist, maybe, but they are in an undefined state. Or rather, I mean, inductive logic is actually what takes place here, not deductive. I guess that's another problem, Big, is that, you know, I'm sort of understanding that you're using inductive logic, or you have to use inductive logic when talking about the world, but you're using deductive logic. You're saying that events take place. That is deductive. You don't use deductive logic when talking about the physical world. Anyway, what I suggest is that you use three-valued logic, right? In symbolic logic, if something is true, the valuation is 1. If something is false, the valuation is 0. If something is undefined, the valuation is the pound symbol on your phone, or hashtag. In other words, it means unknown or undefined. And there's a whole system of logic, of like propositional logic, that works with these three symbols. You know, P and Q. Or like if P can be, you know, you can have like P and Q, or P implies Q, where P and Q can take on values of 1, 0, and hashtag. Anyway, so what I'm saying, how does this relate to objective and subjective? Well, objective versus subjective never seeks to discuss events we don't know about. The words always operate within the realm of knowable truths, i.e. truths that are dependent on consciousness. Again, so Big, his response. You seem to put a lot of stake in us knowing if an event happened or not, but knowing an event and an event happening are two completely different things. They aren't intrinsically linked. Reality does not revolve around our consciousnesses. Our consciousness merely allows us to observe reality. No, Big. That is incorrect. Reality literally does... Consciousness merely allows us to observe reality. They don't allow us to observe reality. They allow us to observe an approximation of reality. Alright? What we observe, the reality we observe, is dependent on our consciousness. It is fundamentally dependent on our consciousness. So whether an event happened and whether we know about it happening are intrinsically linked in a way. Because if we don't know that an event happened, if we don't feel its effects, or if we can't perceive it in any sort of way, then it didn't happen as far as science is concerned. Saying it happened or didn't happen at that point is meaningless. Again, three-valued logic, Big. Anyway, I'm trying to draw it back because I don't want to seem arrogant, so I say, well, nobody said anything about reality revolving. Observing reality and knowing whether or not events occur are the only things we have to work with. The entire view carries humility with it. Once you start thinking you know the universe the way it really is, you get arrogant and will make mistakes. It's important for us to be aware that we are limited, fallible, and flawed in our perception of reality. And this is where it sort of dies down. I think I got him to agree, even though I'm pretty sure that if we ran into one another, we would get into another one of these arguments because of how to use the word objective. So Big says, I see you seem to be arguing more from an advancing humanity standpoint. I'm arguing from a truth standpoint. That is why your answers seem to be so cautious. Cautious? My answers were cautious because I didn't want to offend you, Big. Not because I'm arguing from an advancing humanity standpoint. Truth, advancing humanity, to me those are the same thing. Right? Part of advancing humanity means finding the truth, but the only truth that exists is the known truth or the knowable truth. The unknown or unknowable truth are not subjects of inquiry. They can't be by definition, so stop saying that their objective refers to them. I don't know about that. Truth and advancing humanity aren't mutually exclusive. They're not, but in many instances they aren't in alignment either. Okay, well I don't know what cases you're talking about. You obviously aren't talking to scientists then, because for scientists, advancing humanity and truth are the same thing. They are both two sides of the same coin. This is how they advance humanity. They advance humanity by learning the truth. Anyway, at this point I disengaged. I said, fair enough, at this point here I'll disengage. Hopefully you've understood why I've adopted a slightly different definition of objective, because honestly this was 70 comments long and I didn't want to continue discussing it. But holy shit! This is the issue that you run into semantics arguments. This is the problem with metaphysics, is that people don't understand their own semantics. I'll return to this one sentence that Big said. He said, well, of course events that take place without us knowing about them can't be discussed. We don't know about them. Does that mean that these events didn't happen or events don't exist until they're discussed? Again, your first sentence contradicts your second sentence. Your first sentence suggests you can't talk about events you don't know about. Your second sentence literally has you talking about events you don't know about. The thing you're talking about is contradicting the thing that you're saying in sentence 1. Like this is 20 go to 10, okay? Right? It's like we can't talk about events we don't know about. We can't discuss events we don't know about. Sentence 1. We can't talk about events we don't know about. We can't discuss events we don't know about. Sentence 2. Do these events take place? Do these events happen? No! Go back to sentence 1. Reread sentence 1, okay? If you got down to sentence 2, you made a mistake. Go back and reread sentence 1. 2, go to 1. This is a loop. We're going in a freaking circle because you don't understand, Big, that what you are talking about is contradicting what you're saying. Your first sentence says you can't discuss or talk about events you don't know about. And the second sentence has you deductively talking about events that you don't know about. You just said you can't discuss these events, and then you are discussing these events. You can't do that, Big. You can't do that. Pay attention to your performative norm. Pay attention to what you're doing, and not just what you're saying. What you're doing and what you're saying have to be in line. The one thing I absolutely hate is hypocrisy. Not the kind of moral hypocrisy, that's not even that bad. This is the kind of hypocrisy I absolutely loathe. It's the kind of hypocrisy where what you're doing is an obvious contradiction with what you're saying. What you're saying is, we can't talk about events we don't know about, and then what you're doing is you're talking about events you don't know about. The only statement you can make about unknown, unknowable events is that you can't know them. That's the only statement you can make about. The only logically consistent statement you can make about unknown, unknowable events is that you don't know them. And you can't talk about them, and you can't discuss them. That's the only statement you can make. Any other statement about their nature, about the nature of events that take place, about the nature of events that we don't know about, or that we can't discuss, is nonsense. So saying that they happened or didn't happen is nonsense. They have a, this is where three-valued logic comes in. You give them the value of hashtag. Saying that they happened is not giving it the hashtag value, it's saying that it's true or false, or 1. That's what you keep doing, Big. You keep saying that it's true or false. When it's not true or false, it's hashtag or pound or something inductive, undetermined, because of the admission that it can't be discussed. Oh my god. Let's be absolutely clear, people. Objective does not mean independent of consciousness, because independent of consciousness can't be discussed. Objective means, all objective means, when objective truths, means that we are cutting out certain cultural standards. We aren't considering certain human biases, certain cultural biases, emotional biases. We aren't considering them. What we do consider when it comes to objective is we are considering scientific standards and scientific biases. This is for, realistic truths. For reality, objective reality, this is what you're doing. For objective morality, we do consider certain human emotions, but not all human emotions. The whole point of objective is that objective, the word objective, its use, all it does is it seeks to cut out the usage of certain human biases within lexicon. Right? You don't, something that is said from the perspective of a certain bias is not objective because an objective truth or an objective, right, an objective truth or an objective standard is a standard that eliminates that particular bias. If I have bias A, then I'm not being objective if being objective means eliminating bias A or not speaking from the perspective of bias A. That is what objective means, but that is always within the context of knowable, known truths. It is never independent of consciousness. If you start talking about being independent of consciousness, you get into this discussion, and you get into errors by saying, like, things that exist in the mind don't actually exist. Which is a huge fallacy, because then math doesn't exist, which is what Big actually did. So, for those of you who understand what I said, Great. Those of you who still adopt the classic old definition of objective and subjective, you have to understand you can't partition reality into objective and subjective. You can't do that. What you need to understand is that all the word objective means is that it is not independent of all consciousness, it is independent of certain conscious biases. That is it. That is the only thing objective means, and that is the only thing it should mean, and that is why objective yields a kind of consensus among scientists. That's pretty much all I have to say this time. Sorry if I got a little angry. I prefer not to think about it as angry, though. I prefer to think about it as passionate. Anyway, cheers.